threats range anywhere from things like jamming of communication signals that transit the domain, to cyber intrusions, to actual anti-satellite weapons, directed energy type threats. Those are out there and they're a reality. And so the United States said, given those threats and given that vital national interest, we need to have a separate service to be able to be good stewards of this domain.
Recall only a year ago that in December, not even a full year ago, December 2019, the U.S. Space Force was established as the newest branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. It organizes, trains, and equips space forces. But how did the USSF come to be? And how will the Space Force serve our national interest? And looking ahead, will we still have our traditional allies and competitors in space, or will there be new opportunities and challenges? So we are about to have a very special conversation about all of this and other items with Air Force Lieutenant General William Liquori, who is the Director of Strategic Requirements, Architecture and Analysis, Headquarters, United States Space Force. He'll be talking with retired Air Force General Jack Weinstein from BU's Pardee School. But before General Weinstein introduces our speaker, let's take a look at the video our guest has brought to us.
Some people look to the stars and ask, what if? Our job is to have an answer. We have to imagine what will be imagined. Plan for what's possible while it's still impossible. Maybe you weren't put here just to ask the questions. Maybe you were put here to be the answer. Maybe your purpose on this planet isn't on this planet.
Fantastic. So General Weinstein, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mary. I am really excited about introducing our guest speaker, a good friend of mine, Lieutenant General Bill Liquori. Bill Liquori has had a great career, I'll say a brilliant career in the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force. But that is because he's a 1991 graduate of Boston University, where he got a degree in computer science. He has been he's a graduate and former instructor at the United States Air Force Weapons School. He has operational experience deployed to Operation Southern Watch in Enduring Freedom. He has commanded a space squadron and was a commander of the 50th Space Wing at Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado. Bill and I worked together in the Pentagon when he was a senior military assistant to the Undersecretary of the Air Force. And before his current assignment, he was the Director of Space Policy at the National Security Council, Executive Office of the President. So General Liquori, over to you. I'm looking forward for you to explain to our audience how did the Space Force come to be, and what's the reason that the United States now has a separate service solely dedicated to space.
Super. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, General Weinstein. Thank you to WorldBoston and GBH for the opportunity to join you. I will say I'm a little bit jealous. I wish this was done in person. I wish we weren't in this environment, because any chance to get to Boston is a good thing. So let's start at the important stuff. As General Weinstein alluded to, I graduated from Boston University, was commissioned from the ROTC detachment there, Det 355. Go Terriers. Just two quick slight corrections, I guess, from where we started, and it's really just a testament to how fast things are evolving in the Space Force. So as of last month, I have transferred my commission, so I am now a United States Space Force Lieutenant General, and in this new capacity, I'm the Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Strategy, Plans, Programs, and Requirements. So similar to my last job, but now working on the space staff here at the Pentagon. Again, it's an exciting time in a fast-moving time, and so I think those are just two examples of how fast things are actually moving. I have strong ties to the Boston area. So when the opportunity presented itself to be a part of this forum, I was excited to do that. My dad was a 30-year Air Force veteran, so we moved around a lot, but both of my parents are from Western Massachusetts. My wife and I met at Boston University, and we now have 2 children that are in the town of Boston. One is a music teacher at a high school there, and my daughter is a senior at Boston College, studying to be a teacher and rowing on the rowing team whenever the pandemic allows. So always good to be with the Boston faithful, if you will. By way of introduction, General Weinstein talked about a few key jobs, but a 29-year space professional. So when I left Boston University, I came right into the space business. At that time, I was a part of the Air Force. My early jobs were focused on operations, and then as often happens as we progress in our careers, we move more into strategy and policy making aspects of things. And really, he alluded to my time as the Director for Space Policy at the National Security Council, where I had the opportunity to kind of be a part of a team that was at the forefront of where we are today. And one of the things that we worked on very, very early on there was truly recognizing that the United States has a vital national interest in the space domain. And we defined it at that time as unfettered access and freedom to operate in space, the first half. But the second half of that vital national interest is equally, if not more important, and that's in order to advance our national security, our economic prosperity, and scientific knowledge of this great nation. The reality is all of us likely use space at least once or twice today, even before we got on this call. Whether you filled your car at the pump using a pay at the pump, whether you use an ATM machine or just navigating, whether you're navigating streets in Boston or elsewhere, the wonderful capabilities that are provided by our global positioning system, all of that enables our American way of life. And really, it's that vital national interest that drove us to develop a national space strategy and to ensure that even our national security strategy recognized the advantages of the space domain and that we needed to be able to protect those for our nation and its way of life. I can't think of a better way to step from recognizing a vital national interest to a national strategy. The next natural step was to say, if the space domain is truly that important to our way of life, then why wouldn't we treat it the same in the U.S. military anyway as our other domains? And so the United States Space Force was established in order to protect and defend our capabilities and things that enable our way of life here in the United States. So that's really the kind of quick story, if you will, of how we got here to a United States Space Force, and we're almost through our inaugural year.
So General Liquori, I'd like you to explain to the audience, what has the United States Space Force accomplished in the first year since you became a separate service?
Sure. So a great question and a good segue. If we could go to the slide that has some of the images on it, these depict some of the early activities that happened. You'll see in the upper left-hand corner our new logo. The motto is listed there as well, Semper Supra, Latin for always above, indicating our never-ending commitment to protecting our advantages in the space domain. You'll see just the familiar now blue stitching of our Space Force camouflage uniforms. You'll see the first Space Force flag being unfurled with the Secretary of the Air Force and Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond. And so those are some of the kind of visible mementos, if you will. And then in the lower right-hand corner, what you see there are different pictures from across the last month as we've begun to transfer people into the service. And so we're in the process of transferring about 2,400 space professionals into the United States Space Force. Actually, the next group were confirmed by the Senate last night, and so we'll continue to bring even more personnel into the service. But these are some of the early things that we did in the early months of the service. And the interesting thing is, some on the line might say, okay, but those aren't really the important things. What are you doing from systems and capabilities? And absolutely systems and capabilities are important, but when you stand up the first new branch of the military in the United States in 72 years, establishing culture and identity from the very beginning is critically important. All of the space professionals that we rely on to do their individual jobs within this service want to have an identity. They want to be a part of an organization. And so these tangible examples that are highlighted here are critical to our workforce and were an important part of the first year of establishment, if you will. In addition to uniforms and logos and then personnel, one of the things that every service is responsible for is writing doctrine, which tells us how to organize as a service, which leans on past experiences to help define culture, identity, and processes. If we could go to the next slide. You'll see there, depicted on the right is the cover of our very first inaugural doctrine document in the United States Space Force, titled Space Power. I highlight a couple things on the left-hand side here for our audience. One of the most critical things that this document does is it recognizes the United States Space Force's 3 cornerstone responsibilities to our nation. And that is to preserve our freedom of action in the domain, to enable the rest of our military services joint lethality and effectiveness, and to be able to provide our national leaders independent options. Those define the why the United States Space Force exists. If you go down to the next portion of this slide, we talk to in this document in an entirely separate chapter, these 5 core competencies, from space security to combat power projection, to space mobility and logistics, to information mobility, which is what many will know as some of our classic missions, our global positioning system, which does position, navigation, and timing, communications. When it comes down to it, all of those special space mission names are really about moving information around the battle space. And then lastly, every single service needs to maintain awareness of what's going on in their domain, from friendly activity to potentially harmful activity. And so space domain awareness is another critical piece of our core competencies in this doctrine document. So this was published, at the 7 to 8 month point of the new service, which is really actually a very fast path to get to a first doctrine document. In my last job, I actually had a United Kingdom liaison officer that worked with me, and he described for me that it took about 4 years as they worked some of their early doctrine. And so just in a contrast here, to be able to put this out in the first year was something that Chief Raymond was very, very focused on. Part of the reason this happened is we had a group of young, agile, innovative, and bold space professionals working in the Air Force at the time, before we were even a separate service, that got together on their own time via Zoom or Skype or phone call, and said, hey, if we truly are going to become a separate service, we're going to need to have our doctrine. And so they began to draft this document, and they did it on their own. They did it on their own time. They published an early version on their own dime, and they then shared it with senior leaders in the field, mentors of theirs, to say, hey, critique our ideas. Where do we get this right? Where do we get it wrong? And then ultimately, the National Defense Authorization Act was signed in December of last year, and off we go with a separate service. And 1 month later, we had a doctrine summit, and we said, let's put the fine tuning on this doctrine document so that we can have it ready as we transfer new people into the service. They can all read and understand and begin to embrace our culture, identity, and core competencies.
I'll tell you, Bill, that is really exciting. And I think what's also, we've had visionaries for years. When you looked on that slide and you saw what General Schriever said in 1957, I will tell you that I was extremely excited, and my students will be excited, because we're actually going to read your doctrine document in one of my courses, because it falls right in line with one of the items they're going to be covering this semester. So, well,
I guarantee you can add General Raymond to the list of someone who will be excited to hear that. So
that's great. Hey, we got a question from Dane Perry that I think falls right in line with some of the items that you talked about in your doctrine document when it comes to your core competencies and the whole environment. So what do you see as the biggest threat in space right now, and where do you see the biggest threat 10 years from now? And
sure.
Besides the doctrine, what else? How are you planning to support this country based on the threats that exist in space?
So a great question, and thanks for asking it for Dane. So, you know, one of the reasons that we got to a separate service is the recognition that space has become a warfighting domain. We have various countries that are actively pursuing capabilities and in some cases testing capabilities to counter the benefits that United States and our allies get in the space domain. Those threats range anywhere from things like jamming of communication signals that transit the domain, to cyber intrusions, to actual anti-satellite weapons, directed energy type threats. Those are out there and they're a reality. And so the United States said, given those threats and given that vital national interest, we need to have a separate service to be able to be good stewards of this domain. And so those are the types of threats that are out there. And the reason why we need to have those cornerstone responsibilities that I talked about earlier. Our nation, our way of life depends on the space domain. And we need to be able to preserve our freedom of operation there. There's no doubt that our military gets great benefit from the space domain. It has for many, many years. For those that are old enough to remember, you know, the Gulf War was really one of those, the first space war, if you will, where we had space capabilities providing data to our warfighters on the battlefield. That conflict and our success in that was heavily based on capabilities from space. We need to protect that. That is the job of the Department of Defense, and certainly for us in this domain, the job of the United States Air Force.
So that is that's a great lead into another question that we got from Peter Metz that kind of takes I'll say a little different tactic is, hasn't the UN called for prohibiting the militarization of space? So how is the United States Space Force consistent with that?
Sure, a very fair question. So there is absolutely, the United Nations has a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. I've actually, in my past job at the National Security Council, been a part of preparing U.S. delegations for those meetings. We absolutely would prefer that conflict does not extend into space. It's a bad day for all of us if for some reason conflict does extend into space. And so we want to pursue all instruments of national power to prevent that. In the United States Space Force, our role is to be ready in the event that it does. We believe that the best way to deter that conflict is to be prepared to win if it did extend into space. But that doesn't mean that the United States, and certainly on the military side, we wouldn't participate and want to have success in forums like the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Again, you know, multiple levers that the United States has to work with our allies and to ideally build coalitions that can get to. One of the things that we'd like to get to is to be able to document, you know, what is responsible behavior in space. That would benefit all of us, so that then we could identify what is irresponsible behavior in space and be able to have ways to deal with that. And so a great question, but I think it would be irresponsible for us as the United States Space Force and the Department of Defense to not be prepared for those threats to materialize in the space domain. We know they are there, and so that is one of the reasons that the Space Force was established.
So if we could just amplify that just a little bit more, General Corey. So obviously the Chinese, Russians have been pretty active. Why don't you talk a little bit about their anti-satellite test and what threat that shows to the domain?
Sure. So, well, in 2007 is probably the one that's most visible to anybody that follows the domain. The Chinese used a direct ascent anti-satellite weapon to test the weapon. They destroyed one of their own satellites, a defunct weather satellite. At the time of that, in January of 2007, that was a highly kinetic event. It created over 3,000 pieces of debris, many of which are still in orbit today, and are now a factor for all of us that operate in the domain. As those pieces of debris orbit in outer space, they come in close contact to other satellites and systems that are providing critical capabilities to the United States, our allies, and to the rest of the world. And so, you know, to tie it back to a conversation I had on the doctrine document, space domain awareness is one of those core competencies that we have in the service. And that is all about what is going on in the domain, what is going on from friendly satellites to potentially threatening satellites to pieces of debris that can be as threatening as an adversary capability. The speed with which things orbit in outer space means that a very, very small piece of debris can take out an entire system satellite, and we don't want that to happen. So a key piece of what we do is that space domain awareness mission as well.
So let's go down that road a little bit more. We know space junk is really a huge problem. Space, as you mentioned, is a contested and congested domain. What capability does the United States Space Force have to see into the domain? And are you getting new capabilities so you can actually map what's happening in space and how that's impacting, whether that's a commercial user in space or NASA or military?
Sure. So I'll focus on the domain awareness piece. If I don't in that conversation come back to the commercial side, please double back with me so we can talk about that, because the commercial sector is absolutely critical to our success in the United States and equally critical to our success as a U.S. Space Force. But specific to the first question on domain awareness, historically, the United States has maintained what we call a space catalog, and it's basically a list of orbital elements. So think of them as the mathematical properties that define an object's orbit in space. And it's been a laundry list of, upwards of 20,000 objects that are out in space, from working satellites to defunct satellites to rocket bodies that put those satellites on orbit to bolts and other pieces of debris that are out there. When space was a benign domain, just knowing where those things were was good enough. But as our adversaries have pursued capabilities and created space as a warfighting domain, we need to now know more than just there are things out there. We need to know what they're doing, how close are they getting, what types of capabilities do they have. And so we use a series of sensors and communication links to do that. Things from ground-based radars to on-orbit systems. We have a particular system called the Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program. That's a mouthful, but it's basically a camera in space that's like the traffic cop, if you will, to monitor what is going on in orbit for both ourselves and our allies, so that we know what systems are out there operating near us in the domain. This is certainly an area that is ripe to continue to grow, to increase the fidelity of these sensors, to increase the ability of those sensors to be, the data to be shared, to ultimately, at the end of the day, get as much domain awareness as possible. And I'll save you having to go back to the question, because this is where I can pivot to the commercial side. There are many commercial companies out there that are pursuing space domain awareness capabilities as well. And we certainly look to partner with them and do partner with some of them. So the National Space Defense Center is in Colorado Springs out at Schriever Air Force Base. They actively work with data from commercial satellites to increase our space domain awareness. Another place that I would highlight our commercial partners is actually at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California. We have a commercial integration cell there at our Combined Space Operations Center, where we have industry partners sitting side by side with our space professionals on the operations floor, comparing notes on what's going on in the domain. The reality is those threats that I mentioned, whether they be natural or man-made, affect all of us in the domain, not just the U.S. military. And so partnering with our commercial partners, not only in the space domain awareness mission, but in other areas, we wouldn't have the capabilities we have on orbit today without our industrial partners.
So you kind of mentioned this, and I want to go a little deep dive on the allies and our partners are really key for working together as a community, and that was one of the strengths. Obviously, when it was the United States Air Force working in space, and now the United States Space Force. So talk a little bit about your allies and partners you're working with, and any new agreements you've done since the United States Space Force has stood up.
Sure. So another great question, and another great example that the United States Space Force doesn't do this alone. For a long time in our history, as you've sort of alluded to, even when we were on the Air Force side, we've worked to strengthen our alliances and partnerships in this domain. Probably the shining example of that is the Combined Space Operations Forum. which currently includes our Five Eye partners, so the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as France and Germany. I mentioned that operations center at Vandenberg, and for those that were paying close attention, I called it the Combined Space Operations Center. So in the military, when we have a center that has allies and partners that are working in it, we call it a combined center. So that just the name itself highlights the importance. And there are allies that are there that are actually filling crew positions side by side with the United States Space Force personnel, monitoring the domain for all of us. Combined Space Operations Forum also works, they meet on, our senior leaders meet on an annual basis. Currently, we're doing it in a virtual environment as opposed to traveling, but to talk about things that are important to each of our nations in the domain and how important the domain is to each of our nations, how important knowing what's going on, that domain awareness is, and how important it is to continue to message the importance of responsible behavior in the domain. And so those have led to, I don't have the exact number, and we can certainly double back, but we're upwards of 80 space situational awareness sharing agreements with various countries to be, again, all of us operate in the domain, and so knowing what's going on there is important. And so what we're trying to do is evolve those into kind of two-way data sharing as allies and partners begin to develop their own domain awareness capabilities. The other thing that we do in that forum is we talk about space architectures. And so in February of this year, again, probably 2 months into our time as a separate service, we hosted out in Colorado Springs a coalition space architecture workshop where I brought in my team at the time responsible for each of our mission areas to give our allies briefings on our current capabilities and where we were thinking about evolving our architectures so they could see where we were going and then share with us where they want to go. And also, ideally, we find areas where we'd be complementary. Working together at the end of the day makes us much stronger in the domain and just benefits all of us.
So can you go into a little bit specifics? When you talk about the Combined Space Operations Center, and I remember when it went from a Joint Space Operations Center, we called it Combined, there's been a lot of names. For the Combined Space Operations Center, can you say what nations are actually working side by side, members of the United States Space Force?
Sure. So we have our Five Eyes partners there. Well, so let me do it this way. There are two elements at Vandenberg. There's the Combined Space Operations Center, and then there's a multinational space collaboration cell. Across both of those, we're talking about those Five Eyes partners, so United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, France, and Germany. We've had discussions with the Japanese as well. And General Raymond, certainly as the Chief of Space Operations, looks forward to expanding on those countries at any point in time to be able to, again, bring more people into the fold, compare notes, share capabilities, develop complementary capabilities with each other. One of the other things that we do with those allies are we do war games. So all services have war games. It's ways for us to test new theories about operating and succeeding in the domain. And so on the space side, we've had for some time what we call the Schriever war game. You alluded to General Schriever being on that slide earlier. Certainly one of our space pioneers, if you will, a big strategic thinker who saw the importance back in the 50s of the domain. So these Schriever War Games series, we've converted those into international games. And so we bring those same partners in and we posture certain scenarios to the game players and to the senior leadership, both on the military and the political side. And we see how that evolves in the game. And we do red moves and then blue moves, and we talk about the implications of those. By doing things like that and by having allies on the floor at Vandenberg, we increase our touch points with our partners. And that includes on the commercial side. And by increasing those touch points, we find areas of more commonality and we begin to speak the same language and focus on the same things.
The Schriever War Game series, I remember one year participating and I was in charge of the red cell. So it feels good once in a while to play the bad guy to see how the good guys will do it. So that was a great, and at that time, there were a lot of I'll say internal people. We had commercial industry there. There was a lot of different players, and it's great having our allies in the room with us as we're discussing some really critical issues that could apply to the space domain.
So could I expand on that 1 second, sir? Just I'll tell a little anecdote that Chief Raymond likes to tell. So in 2014 or 15, when I was the wing commander out at Schriever Air Force Base, we were executing one of these Schriever War Games, and we were hosting it at Schriever Air Force Base. And General Raymond at the time was a 3-star at Vandenberg, our Joint Force Space Component Commander. And when he came to the game, he role-played himself, basically. And so we put him through the same scenarios with the game players. It was really one of our first times to have this commercial integration cell, if you will. And so he would engage with these industry partners throughout the game. We developed moves together, got great benefit from it. The game finished, we documented lessons learned, and then he returned to Vandenberg and got back into his day-to-day business of running the center there. And a particular, I don't even remember, a particular event happened in the space domain, and he immediately turned to his team and he said, "Where's the commercial integration cell?" And of course, there were a bunch of people with these kind of sheepish looks on their face and said, well, sir, we don't really have one. We just did it in the game recently. And he immediately said, okay, we have to have one. It's imperative. And so, within that year, instantly there's a commercial integration cell, and it has only grown from there. And so tribute to all of our both commercial and allied partners that are partnering with us in this domain.
It's really fascinating. The year I was there, obviously multiple years, being a space guy for many years, we had separate cells, and the separate cells were just divided up by those little barriers you see in an office building. And then it took the game players about 5 days to realize that they could actually move those walls apart and actually talk to each other. The culture of seeing that grow, but you're right. If something happens in space, one of the first things you're going to do is look at your commercial partners to see if A, do they have an issue, or B, how can they work to help go through that? Let's go back to year one, which was right around the corner, but let's go back and talk about how the United States Space Force, you are a separate service. So how are you organizing your separate service to have that special culture you need being space warriors?
Sure. So a great question. One of the things that we know is based on the laws that have been passed and all expectations is we are the smallest service in the United States military. We're going to be probably about 16,000 people, space professionals. That drives a certain way of doing business. It drives us to have to change. One of the other things that's highlighted in that doctrine document is that we value innovation, agility, and boldness. We will not be able to operate as a United States Space Force the same way that we did as space professionals within the Air Force and the rest of the Department of Defense. We are going to have to change processes. But let's talk organization for a second first. So on the Air Force side, as you may recall, we typically had 5 levels of command from our numbered air forces, which were typically a 2 or a 3-star level command, down to a major command first, a 4-star level command, then a numbered air force, and then we would get into wings, which was a senior colonel, groups, which would have been a junior colonel, and our squadrons, which would have been a lieutenant colonel. So on the officer side, and most of those would all have a chief master sergeant that was a critical partner in the command team, if you will. We don't have enough people to build into that size of an organization. So one of the first things that Chief Raymond did was to say, we're going to streamline our organizational structure. And so we've gone from 5 to 3 levels. And so we have what we call our field commands, which will have one focused on operations, one focused on acquisition, and another one focused on training and readiness. And below that, we will have a single level of colonel level command, which we are calling a Delta. A very unique name, which will be exciting to some, it will be confusing to some, but it's a part of establishing this new identity. We debated using historical names that might be out there, and we felt it was important enough. We actually crowdsourced. We went out to the force and said, hey, what do you want to be called? And this one, bubbled to the top. Delta has a long history in military space from an icon side of things, and so we said that's what we're going to do. So that's our second level of command, and then we'll have squadrons, which is where the day-to-day operations happen. So going from 5 levels to 3 has been a critical piece of our organizational structure. The other structure organizationally is the staff itself here at the Pentagon. Our sister services have staffs that are here. We are in the process of building out the staff, but we certainly will be a much smaller staff. General Raymond will have basically 4 deputy chiefs, if you will. I'm one that's focused on strategy and resourcing. He'll have another one focused on operations, or he does have another one focused on operations. That's General Saltzman, another Boston University graduate. He and I were classmates together and got commissioned together in 91. He'll have a director of staff. He'll have a human capital officer. Miss Pat Mulcahy is our Chief Human Capital Officer. And then unique to this service, because General Raymond wants to really make the Space Force the first truly digital service, he's established a Chief Technology and Innovation Office as one of those other deputies. And right now, Major General Kim Kreider is helping us with that. Actually, last night the Senate confirmed our new Vice Chief of Space Operations, General David Thompson, who's has been here working in other capacity, and it was confirmed last night to be the Vice Chief. So that's the extent of the leader. And excuse me, I need to mention one more, and I'll hear from it when I go up to his office. But Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman is our senior enlisted leader in the United States Space Force, and just is a phenomenal teammate, working with us on all of these things, ranging from personnel to operations, and making sure that we're doing the combination, and the team is making sure we're doing this right across officer, enlisted, and civilian personnel in this service. And so it'll be a relatively small staff. I believe we're going to settle at just under 600 probably here on Pentagon staff, if you will. So a very lean service, which means we're going to have to do things differently.
No, it's an exciting thing. And I'll tell you, for Chief Raymond, it will be being able to have your 4 senior leaders sit around a small table and discuss issues will make things a lot faster than perhaps another service would do it. I'd like to open up to an audience question. I do not want to apologize. I'll apologize up front if I mispronounce the name, but Raul Liebert, if you could please go ahead and ask General Liquori a question.
Yes, my question is about your mission. Where does space end? Is it orbital only? Will it cover Mars and Moon settlements and asteroid mining? And in places where there's settlements, will it be the civil law and arrange and negotiate conflicts with other settlements on the same areas?
Sure. So a great question, sir. And certainly this, like many things, is going to evolve over time. For the time being, our mission is focused where the United States operates in space. And so that tends to be in the area below the moon, if you will. So we call geosynchronous orbit is one of our orbital regimes that we tend to focus on. So orbiting around the Earth. Now, obviously, our partners in NASA have outer space probes that go well beyond that. Our responsibility as the United States Space Force is to protect U.S. and allied advantages and systems in space. And so if at some point in the future we need to move beyond where we typically operate today, then we'll certainly be a part of that conversation and look to continue to fulfill our mission. If the United States has systems that are operating beyond where we do today, then we will certainly begin to develop capabilities that will allow us to maintain that domain awareness that I talked about beyond where we currently do.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question.
So let me ask a real simple question that I hear every once in a while. So are you guys going to have a separate academy? I'm just waiting for the United States Space Force football team to be playing the cadets at West Point or the midshipmen at Annapolis.
So great question. I don't think we're going to have that in the near future, but let me talk about that. So for the time being, many on the net probably know that our United States Air Force Academy is in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And actually, another cool part of the first year of the United States Space Force is just this past spring, we commissioned direct into the United States Space Force our first second lieutenants right out of the Air Force Academy. So Chief Raymond and Chief Goldfein joined Secretary of the Air Force Barrett at that graduation ceremony, and we commissioned upwards of 80 second lieutenants into the service, and they were, you know, our first second lieutenants commissioned straight into the service. So that's what we did this year for all of those students or cadets that were there that were focusing on space studies or wanted to come into the new service. You know, General Raymond was ecstatic with the amount of interest from the Academy. What we're doing going forward is we've established a separate Space Force office at the Academy, headed up by a Space Force Colonel, Jeff Greenwood, who I worked with out in Colorado Springs. And he's working with the Academy leadership to now evolve the curriculum to make sure that it's you know, they've always had a strong aerospace engineering curriculum. The Air Force Academy has always been a very strong engineering school. We want to be able to help continue to evolve that curriculum into areas that will benefit not only the Air Force, but the Space Force. And so that'll be happening in the coming years. Another exciting part of being on the ground floor of establishing a service is how to evolve our Academy.
No, that sounds great. We have a question now from Raul Alcala. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. General, would you address how the Space Force envisions having, in fact, or planning for offensive and defensive capabilities, both based on Earth and based in space?
Sure. So, you know, one of those core competencies that I highlighted from our doctrine document was combat power projection. And really that's the function of the Department of Defense. That's the function of each of our military services, is to be able to project power within the domain. I think all of us would prefer that we don't have conflict in any of our domains, but the reality is that's where we are. That's where the world has evolved. And so war fighting involves defense and offense, and that's certainly part of combat power projection. You know, ideally, we develop these capabilities to convince others that, hey, if you're thinking about extending conflict into the space domain, it's not really going to work out that way and what you're hoping. You're not going to get the benefits that you're looking for. You know, equally important is the defensive side of things, to protect what's up there and to evolve our architectures to be more resilient. You know, many of the systems that are on orbit today were designed and developed decades ago when we weren't worried about space as a warfighting domain. And so we have to evolve our architectures that way as well on the defensive side.
The next question comes from a Pardee graduate student that I know very well. Ahmed Azari, why don't you go ahead and with the question for General Liquori?
For sure. Hi, Professor Weinstein. Hi, Professor Liquori, General Liquori. So my question was going to be about like the interconnectedness of the space domain. It's extremely interconnected. How is communication handled in the Pentagon because of all of this?
So can you expand a little bit on what you mean by interconnected? I just want to make sure I address your question in the right way.
Sure. So like anything that impacts the space domain impacts the military, the Navy, the Air Force, the civilians, so on and so forth.
Absolutely. Very insightful question. And really, you know, that again ties to why we now have a separate and independent service, right? You know, just our American way of war and even our allies is definitely enabled by the space domain. You know, it just makes us more effective as a military service. The types of information that we can collect and then transmit through our domain into other domains. One of the things that the Department of the Air Force, so both of our services, the U.S. Air Force and the United States Space Force, is working with our other services on, is a concept that we're evolving in the U.S. military right now called Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And that is a fact that says conflicts in the future are not going to have our traditional battle lines that might be just lines on a terrestrial battlefield or certain lanes on the sea, conflict is going to move, to your point, and we're very interconnected. The way that we're going to succeed as a United States military is by being able to share information, by being able to present complicated scenarios for potential adversaries from multiple domains simultaneously, and being able to command and control forces across all domains simultaneously is absolutely critical. And so on the United States Space Force side, we bring satellite communications to that, as well as, we've started to develop what we call a unified data library, and in the Department of the Air Force, what we call our advanced battle management system, which is really think of it as the Internet of Things, if you will, for our capabilities, and how that interconnectedness that you alluded to in your question, how do we move things around? We can't only operate in the space domain and only operate in the air domain and only operate in the land and the sea domains. We have to do it together. And so it's a great question, very insightful, and that's a few of the ways that we're looking to make sure we stay connected.
So, General, that's great. I want to take what Ahmed said and then kind of, can you talk a little bit about the organization piece and how you're dealing with cyber? Because cyber and space are so interconnected. How is the United States Space Force dealing with that?
Absolutely. So two things right off the bat. There are very few things that we do in the space domain that are not enabled by the cyber domain, and that's been the case for a long time. So we're interconnected and never to be separated, really. One of the other things that's in that doctrine document that we talked about are what we call our 7 space power disciplines. And you can think of those as career fields, if you will, that are a part of the United States Space Force. Besides space operator, cyber professional is also one of those other space power disciplines, if you will. We will share, they are one of what we would call our shared career fields between the Air Force and the Space Force. And so we'll have some, and the Air Force will have some. But ours will take that doctrine document and the organizations that they're a part of and make sure that we have the cyber capabilities that we need, make sure to protect the cyber capabilities that enable these space missions. They're a critical piece from the beginning of designing a space system to operating the system. That our two domains are inextricably linked, and cyber professionals are certainly one of those. Just to not leave the others out, besides operators and cyber professionals, we have intel professionals, acquisition professionals, and engineers as well that'll make up the space power disciplines.
Excellent. So don't let me forget this until the end. We need to figure out how to sign up, because we're going to have a lot of people excited about getting involved in the United States Space Force. I want to turn it over now to Daniel, who has a question.
Sure.
Good evening, sir. My question is, what would be the best way for somebody who wants to get into that field to support Space Force?
Sure. So Daniel, tell me a little bit about yourself so I can answer this the right way. A student right now in the workforce? Where?
Currently finishing up time in the Civil Air Patrol program, which was my first introduction to Space Force. And then I'm looking into getting in with the State Department and U.S. Congress, sir.
Sure, outstanding. So, so you just hit on a couple areas of the other areas of the government that have been absolutely critical to standing up the Space Force. Number one, Congress obviously is the body that passes the laws that the president then, or the bills that the president then signs into law. And we wouldn't be a separate service without the National Defense Authorization Act of last year. Our defense committees, the intelligence committees, and several others, the Commerce Committee, have all been involved in shaping the Space Force and shaping the space domain and our activities in there. So on the legislative side, that is certainly a career path you could take. You mentioned the State Department, and so, yet another piece of our executive branch, but a critical piece, especially when it comes to engaging with the world. If engaging with international partners and policy making and those types of things are of interest to you, I have very, very good friends in the State Department in several different branches that I've worked with throughout my career that have been critical to moving forward. In my capacity at the National Security Council several years ago, my responsibility responsibility as the director for space policy was to coordinate what we call the interagency in the U.S. government. And so that included the State Department, the Director of National Intelligence, certainly the Department of Defense, Commerce Department, Treasury, any of those departments within the U.S. government that deal with space. One of my jobs was to coordinate options for the president and our national leaders, and I could only do that with the participation and support of those other departments and agencies. Now, being selfish, I would tell you, if you have any interest in joining the military, man, I can't think of a more exciting time to join the military and to specifically join the Space Force. And just so I make sure I cover it, since General Weinstein mentioned it, if everybody out there, if you're interested, airforce.com/Space Force is probably the easiest and best way to get out there and to get information about how to join. You know, when I was sitting at Boston University as a cadet, one of the things we had to do in our junior year was figure out what do we want to be when we grow up. And so, you know, joining ROTC at the beginning for me was a way to pay for school. I had a scholarship, and so I did that. But boy, I got hooked within the first week. Just the camaraderie, the sense of being a part of something bigger than yourself. So I got hooked. I had allergies, so that cut me out of being a pilot like my dad was. And so he was still on active duty, and he said, hey, there's this new career field that might speak to your technical side of things, and it's space operations. And so I put that number one on my list. I was fortunate to get started, and it's been off to the races ever since. My wife would describe that the 4-year trial run of, let's see how, you know, I owed 4 years back to the Air Force to pay for that scholarship. It just continued to be a great career for me. And man, as a cadet back then, I never would have imagined sitting here with U.S. Space Force name tapes and being a part of the first military service in the United States in 72 years. So lots of ways to contribute and to be a part of it. And we certainly would welcome you on our side, as I'm sure would other branches of government.
Well, make sure, Bill, when you see your family again, you give them a hug for getting allergies, because your success is geared to not being in a cockpit. We were tied for one more question. Dane, over to you.
General, thank you for this. It's fascinating, and welcome back to Boston virtually. How would you say our space capabilities compare with those of our biggest competitors? With the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, perhaps?
Sure. So a great question.
Behind the curve, ahead of the curve?
Sure. So a great question. The United States, there is no doubt that the United States Space Force and the United States is right at the top of the list as far as space capabilities and what it is that we can do with those capabilities alongside with our allies. However, as we mentioned, space has become a warfighting domain, and we have adversaries. You've listed some that have seen the benefits that we get not only militarily but as a nation from the space domain, and they seek to counter those benefits. And so the reason the Space Force was established was to make sure that we maintain that excellence in the domain and all of the advantages that provides for, again, our national security, our economic prosperity, and our scientific knowledge. And so the key piece of the United States Space Force is to make sure that we maintain where we are now and that we don't fall back as others seek to extend conflict into space.
So just in a, I'll say, quick wrap-up fashion, General Lt, what things that we didn't ask you that you would like to get across?
So I think I'll start with thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of a discussion like this, for the opportunity to be once again connected to Boston. You know, every time my wife and I go visit the city, it's just a wonderful reminder of some great foundational years for us. I want to reemphasize some things. I think we covered a good bit, but I want to reemphasize a couple things. You know, the Space Force was established as an independent service. We take that responsibility very seriously, and our cornerstone responsibilities of ensuring freedom of operation in the domain, enabling joint lethality and effectiveness, and being able to provide independent options for our national decision makers. We don't, however, do that by ourselves. We could not do that without our allies and our partners, both internationally and commercially. We've enjoyed long history of partnering, and we just need to continue to expand on that. And the last one I would highlight, I think, is, we stand here right now on the shoulders of some giants, and they were a part of the United States Air Force, and that's a proud part of our heritage. And so this has been a very good relationship and continues to be from the Secretary of the Air Force down through both of our service chiefs. It's an intent to partner and to be one department of the Air Force. We have our independent role that we'll do in the Space Force, and we'll continue to partner with our brothers and sisters in the Air Force as well as the other military services. And so I think I would leave it at that. For anybody that's on the net that's interested in joining, we absolutely would welcome additional energy and enthusiasm and expertise. And so again, airforce.com/Space Force is a great place to start as far as looking for ways to join.
All right. Well, I think Generals, I've never said that in a plural, Generals Liquori and Weinstein, this has just been a wonderful and mind-expanding conversation. Isn't it wonderful to be talking about a new beginning, something that's just getting started, and the limitless opportunities that are beyond this confusing planet. So just thank you both so much for the conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you also to GBH, as always, for your technical help, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you again.